They say temptation doesn't come dressed in red, whispering sin into your ear. No. It comes quietly, politely, wearing a warm smile and asking for a cup of tea. I remember that day like it just happened. The smell of fresh pastries in the kitchen, the sound of rain tapping gently against the window, and me, standing there, trying to be the kind, welcoming mother I'd always been. If someone had told me that one simple invitation would shake the foundation of everything I believed about myself, I would have laughed. But life has a strange way of exposing the cracks you thought no one could see. That afternoon, I invited my son's friend over for tea. Nothing unusual, or so I thought. I'd met him a few times before. Polite. Well-spoken. The kind of young man any parent would be happy their child spent time with. He always said thank you, ma'am, with a smile that felt genuine, respectful. But that day, when he walked through my door, something in the air felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was him. Or maybe it was just the silence of a house that had grown too used to being lonely. You see, people think loneliness is loud, full of crying, or begging, or shouting for attention. But real loneliness? It's quiet. It's the way you stop waiting for a text that never comes. It's setting 2 plates at the table, then quietly putting one back in the cupboard. It's smiling at everyone, while your heart whispers, does anyone even see me anymore? That was me. A woman who had everything that looked right on the outside, a home, a husband, a son, yet deep inside, I was hollow. Daniel, my husband, had become more of a stranger than a partner. We barely talked unless it was about bills, or Ethan's school, or some errand that needed doing. The warmth we used to share had turned into a routine. And in that routine, I stopped feeling alive. So when Liam, my son's friend, came over that day, smiling shyly, asking if it was okay to wait while Ethan ran an errand, I didn't think twice. I said yes, of course. Because why wouldn't I? He was just a boy, sitting at my kitchen table, sipping tea. But the truth is, some stories don't begin with intention. They begin with a moment, a fleeting spark of attention you didn't realize you were desperate for. A smile that lasts a second too long. A conversation that feels a little too easy. A silence that lingers in a way it never did before. As we sat there, talking about nothing and everything, I noticed things I shouldn't have. The way his eyes softened when he spoke. The way he listened, really listened, as if my words mattered. I remember thinking, when was the last time someone looked at me like that? It's strange, isn't it? How validation, even from the wrong person, can feel like oxygen when you've been starving for attention. And that's where it all began, with something so small, so harmless, so human. A conversation over tea, between 2 people who were both quietly broken in their own ways. He'd lost his mother not long ago. I could see the grief still sitting in his eyes. And maybe I thought I could offer comfort. Or maybe I just wanted to feel needed again. I didn't know it then, but that afternoon would become the day that changed everything, my family, my peace of mind, and the person I believed myself to be. Because when 2 lonely hearts cross paths, sometimes the line between comfort and temptation disappears before you even realize you've stepped over it. This isn't a story I'm proud of. But it's one I can't forget, no matter how many times I try. Some nights, when the house is quiet and everyone's asleep, I still see that moment replaying in my mind, the tea, the smile, the silence, and the beginning of a mistake that still haunts me to this day. If you've ever found yourself doing something you swore you never would, if you've ever felt that strange mix of guilt and longing, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what happened next. Subscribe to Stories by TE, where we uncover the hidden emotions behind every forbidden choice. Because sometimes, the stories we're too ashamed to tell, are the ones that need to be heard the most. It's strange how a home can be full of people, and still feel empty. Ours was like that, beautifully arranged, perfectly lit, and utterly cold. You could walk through the house and almost hear the echoes of what used to be laughter. Now, it was just the sound of footsteps, doors closing softly, and conversations that ended before they even began. Daniel, my husband, was a good man, at least on paper. Responsible, successful, disciplined. He provided everything money could buy, but somehow, along the way, he stopped seeing me. He became a ghost of habit, always at work, always exhausted, always distracted. We used to talk for hours about everything, and then suddenly, we didn't talk at all. Now, our conversations were reduced to reminders, bills, chores, dinner plans, Ethan's school. It was like being married to a calendar. The dates changed, but the emptiness stayed the same. I used to look forward to evenings, now I dreaded them. The quiet between us had grown so thick that even breathing felt intrusive. He'd come home, loosen his tie, scroll through his phone, maybe comment on how tired he was, and that was it. We shared a bed, but it felt like we were sleeping in separate lives. There were times I'd cook his favorite meal, just hoping he'd notice. He'd eat absent-mindedly, nodding politely, his eyes glued to his laptop. And I'd smile, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending I wasn't screaming inside for him to just look up. Sometimes I'd imagine flipping the table, just to get a reaction. But instead, I'd quietly clear the plates, wash the dishes, and whisper to myself, maybe tomorrow. Then there was Ethan, our only son. 17, tall, funny, restless. He was my joy and my distraction. But lately, even he had begun to drift away. Teenage years, I told myself, the age when friends become the new family. He'd come home, say a quick "Hey, Mom," grab something from the fridge, and disappear into his room or out with his friends. I missed when he'd tell me about his day, about the little things that mattered to him. Now, I'd learn about his life through the sound of laughter echoing from his phone screen. So I filled the silence with chores, recipes, and memories. I'd rearrange furniture that didn't need rearranging, water plants that were already wet, iron clothes that were already pressed, anything to keep from thinking. And maybe that's why I loved having Ethan's friends over. It made the house feel alive again. Their laughter filled the empty spaces, and for a little while, I could pretend we were a happy, ordinary family. That's how I first really noticed Liam. He wasn't like the other boys. He didn't try too hard to impress or fill every silence with noise. He had this calm presence, gentle, almost old-souled. The kind of person who listens with his whole being. There was something quietly broken about him, like he carried a sadness he didn't know how to put into words. Ethan had mentioned that Liam lost his mother not too long ago. When I heard that, something in me softened. A mother's instinct, maybe, that pull to comfort, to protect. But looking back, maybe it wasn't just that. Maybe it was something deeper, two lonely people who recognized the ache in each other's eyes before either of them said a word. The first time Liam came to our house, I remember watching him from the kitchen window as he walked up the driveway. Tall, a bit shy, polite posture. He knocked gently, like someone who didn't want to disturb. When I opened the door, he smiled, and for a second, I saw it. Not just manners, but longing. Not for me, but for something familiar. Something warm. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady but careful. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. There was a kind of respect in it, the kind that comes from someone who's seen too much too young. I welcomed him in, told him to make himself at home, and called out for Ethan. The two of them disappeared into the living room, laughing, gaming, doing whatever teenage boys do. I went back to the kitchen, but I remember glancing over once in a while, the way Liam looked around, quietly absorbing the room, like he hadn't been in a place that felt like home for a long time. That night, after they left, I caught myself thinking about that look. That searching kind of gaze, the one that says I miss something I can't name. I didn't realize then, that he and I were searching for the same thing. Over the next few weeks, Liam started coming over more often. Sometimes to study, sometimes to just hang out. He was polite, always greeted me, offered to help with little things. He'd say things like, "This place feels peaceful, ma'am," and I'd smile, pretending not to feel that small tug in my chest every time he said it. Peaceful. If only he knew how loud the silence could be when everyone left. I'd hear their laughter from Ethan's room, that deep, carefree sound that I missed so much. It would make me smile for a while, until the sound faded, and I was left alone again with the hum of the refrigerator and my thoughts. Sometimes I'd pour myself a glass of wine, sit by the window, and just listen to the rain. And I'd think about how a house full of everything can still feel like nothing when love no longer lives there. There's a kind of ache that doesn't come from being abandoned, it comes from being forgotten. And I had been forgotten, slowly, silently, over the years. By the man I loved. By the boy who was growing up too fast. And by the version of myself who used to dream. So when Liam smiled that gentle, unassuming smile, when his eyes met mine with something that felt like understanding, I didn't recognize it for what it was, a spark. Because sparks don't always look like fire at first. Sometimes they look like kindness. Sometimes they look like someone finally seeing you when you've spent years feeling invisible. When Liam first walked into our home, I noticed his eyes weren't just polite, they were searching for warmth. I didn't realize then that we were both looking for the same thing. It happened on one of those quiet Saturdays, the kind where time moves differently, where the world outside feels muted and the house hums with stillness. Ethan had told me earlier that morning, "Mom, Liam's coming over. We've got this school project to finish." I smiled, pretending I wasn't secretly glad. Having company meant the house would finally feel alive again, even if only for a few hours. I baked a small cake, made tea, and set the table near the living room window where the light usually fell soft and golden. The kind of afternoon that could have been ordinary, except that it wasn't. They arrived just past noon. Ethan went straight to his room to grab some notes, and Liam followed me into the kitchen to help carry the teacups. I told him he didn't need to, but he insisted. He had this quiet politeness that never felt forced. I remember the moment clearly, the way the sunlight caught the edge of his face, how his voice sounded softer than usual when he said, "Your home always feels warm, ma'am. Peaceful." I smiled, maybe a little too quickly. I told him thank you, that I tried to keep it that way, though deep inside I knew, there was nothing warm about our home anymore. It was a place of quiet routines and unspoken words. But somehow, hearing him say that made me wish it were true. Ethan was in the middle of explaining something when his phone rang. It was his father. Something about a delivery at the hardware store nearby that needed his signature. He looked at me, said, "Mom, I'll be back soon, don't let Liam get bored." Then he dashed out, leaving the door half open and the scent of his cologne behind. And just like that, it was me and Liam, alone. The house felt different the moment the door closed. Not wrong. Not dangerous. Just quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you hear every small sound, the ticking of the clock, the soft whistle of the kettle, even the faint rhythm of two people breathing in the same space. I poured him tea and sat across from him, trying to think of something normal to say. He thanked me again, his fingers brushing the edge of the cup, and for a second, I noticed how steady his hands were, how calm he seemed. We talked about simple things at first, his classes, Ethan's jokes, the weather. But slowly, the conversation began to shift. He asked how my week was. No one ever asked that anymore. So I told him about how busy things had been, how Daniel had been traveling again. He nodded, listening like every word mattered. Then he said softly, "I know how that feels, being in a house that's full, but still feels empty." His eyes dropped, his voice almost breaking on that last word. And that's when he told me about his mother. He spoke about her like she was sunlight. The way she used to hum while cooking, the way her perfume lingered on his school uniform long after she was gone. I could hear his heart breaking between his sentences. And before I knew it, mine was breaking too. I said I was sorry, that grief never really leaves, it just changes shape. He smiled sadly and said, "Sometimes, I still reach for her phone number before remembering she won't answer." Something inside me ached so deeply in that moment that words felt useless. I wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but all I managed was a quiet, "I understand." We sat in silence after that. Not the awkward kind, but the heavy kind, where emotions fill the air thicker than words ever could. Outside, the sky had turned gray. Raindrops began tapping softly against the window, slow at first, then steady, like a heartbeat that refused to calm down. He looked up and smiled, a small, almost boyish smile, and for reasons I still can't explain, warmth crawled up my skin. It wasn't right. It wasn't planned. But for the first time in years, I felt seen. The sound of the rain deepened. The world outside blurred behind streaks of water, and in that soft, dim light, I saw him not as my son's friend, but as a young man who was lonely, lost, and looking for something to hold on to. Something I understood far too well. He reached for the teapot to refill his cup, his hand brushing mine. It was nothing, an accident, probably, but the jolt that ran through me was too real to ignore. I pulled my hand back too quickly, laughed it off, said something about the rain. He just smiled, eyes gentle, and said, "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in how you look, but in how you talk. You have that same calm way." I wanted to say thank you, but my throat felt tight. No one had compared me to warmth in a long time. I looked away, trying to steady my breath. The rain grew louder, and suddenly, the living room didn't feel so big anymore. It felt close. Like the walls had moved in just enough for me to notice the space between us shrinking. We sat there, both pretending to sip our tea, pretending not to feel the strange tension quietly blooming between us. And maybe it was the storm outside, or the loneliness inside both of us, but in that stillness, something fragile shifted. He said softly, "I like being here. It feels safe." And before I could stop myself, I whispered, "I'm glad you do." Our eyes met. The kind of glance that lingers just a second too long. A second you wish you could take back, but don't. The kettle clicked behind us, a reminder of time, of reality, of lines that shouldn't be crossed. I stood up quickly, said I should make more tea, but my hands trembled when I reached for the cups. I could feel his eyes on me, not in a way that was wrong, but in a way that made me feel visible. It was only a few minutes before Ethan came back, but those minutes stretched endlessly, like the universe had paused to watch us quietly fall into something we didn't understand. When Ethan burst through the door, I smiled, too wide, too forced. Liam stood up immediately, thanking me again, his voice calm but his eyes different now. Something had changed. Something we both felt but didn't dare name. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, listening to the same old silence between us, I thought about that afternoon. About the rain, the tea, the tremble in my hands. And the way Liam had looked at me before he left, like he saw something in me I'd forgotten existed. Then, something happened that I can't forget, and wish I could. For days after that afternoon, I told myself it was nothing. Just a harmless moment, two people sharing tea and a memory. But something in me wouldn't let it go. It lingered, like the scent of rain after a storm. I tried to shake it off. Whenever Ethan mentioned Liam, I forced a smile, asked the right questions, said all the right things. But inside, I felt that strange unease again, that warmth crawling up my chest every time I heard his name. It was wrong. I knew that. He was my son's friend. Barely 20. And yet, every time the doorbell rang and I saw him standing there with that same soft smile, something deep inside me stirred. Something I hadn't felt in years. He started coming around more often. Sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone, bringing leftover notes or borrowing a book. It was always innocent, at least, that's what I told myself. But I began to notice things I shouldn't have. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. How he lingered at the doorway just a little longer after saying goodbye. How his gaze would meet mine, steady, searching, before quickly looking away. I told myself it was just maternal affection. That I was only being kind, the way any mother would. But even in that lie, I could feel the truth scratching at the surface. Because at night, when I lay beside Daniel and listened to him snore softly, I couldn't stop replaying that afternoon, the sound of rain, the warmth of his eyes, the tremor in his voice when he spoke about his mother. I told myself I was just thinking about his pain, his loneliness. But really, I was thinking about mine. Daniel and I hadn't touched each other in months. We'd become strangers living parallel lives, two people trapped in the same space but speaking different languages. Every conversation turned into a quiet argument, every dinner ended in silence. There were times he'd come home late, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked, he'd laugh, tell me I was imagining things. I stopped asking. But that silence built something in me, an emptiness that felt heavier each day. So when Liam spoke to me with genuine attention, when he looked at me as if every word I said mattered, I felt something unlock. It wasn't about desire. Not at first. It was about being seen. Being heard. I remember one afternoon vividly. Ethan was running late from football practice, and Liam had come ahead to drop off some materials. He waited in the kitchen while I prepared tea, again. It had become our silent ritual, though we never acknowledged it. He asked if I'd ever thought about going back to work, said I looked like someone who missed being busy, being fulfilled. No one had ever noticed that before, not even Daniel. His tone wasn't flirtatious, but it was tender. And I felt myself smiling, not politely, but genuinely. Then he said, "You have this calmness about you. It's rare." It shouldn't have meant anything. But in that moment, it meant everything. That night, while cleaning the dishes, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, my hair tied carelessly, dark circles under my eyes, a woman slowly fading into routine. And I wondered, when had I last felt beautiful? Not looked beautiful, but felt it? Daniel used to tell me once, "You always glow when you laugh." But he hadn't said that in years. He barely noticed if I was in the room anymore. So when Liam noticed, when he smiled at something small I told myself it was harmless. That he was simply kind. That I was only filling the silence Daniel had left behind. But late at night, lying awake, I'd whisper to myself, why am I thinking about him? And the more I tried to suppress it, the more the thought grew roots. One Sunday morning, I caught myself waiting for Ethan to say he was bringing Liam over. When he didn't, I felt disappointed, then immediately guilty for feeling that way. It was ridiculous. I was a mother. A wife. I had no business craving someone's presence like that. I tried to distract myself, cleaned the house, baked, rearranged the living room. But everything I touched reminded me of him. The teacups. The chair he sat in. Even the faint smell of the rain that day seemed to cling to the curtains. And that's when I realized something terrifying. I was thinking of him not as Ethan's friend, but as Liam. A person who'd become something more than I wanted to admit. That night, Daniel came home late again. He didn't look at me when he entered the room. Didn't say a word. Just undressed, climbed into bed, and turned his back to me. I watched his shoulders rise and fall with every breath. Felt the vast distance between us. And for the first time I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. Nothing except the echo of that warmth I'd felt days ago, when Liam smiled at me in the rain. I turned off the light and lay there in the dark, a truth whispering in the back of my mind, one I didn't want to face. I told myself it was nothing, that I was simply filling a void Daniel had left behind. But deep down, I knew I was craving the validation I'd been starved of for years. And as I drifted into sleep, one thought echoed louder than the rest. I didn't realize how blurred the line between comfort and temptation could become, until that day. After that day, things started to change, slowly at first, almost too subtle to notice. But I noticed. Liam started visiting more often. Sometimes, he'd drop by before Ethan got home from practice, saying he just needed to return something or ask about the project they were working on. At first, I'd tell him, "Ethan's not home yet, dear," expecting him to turn around. But he'd smile and say, "That's okay. I don't mind waiting." And somehow, neither did I. It began with small, harmless conversations. He'd sit at the edge of the kitchen counter while I chopped vegetables or folded laundry, asking questions that felt too deep for his age. He told me about his mother, how she used to hum while cooking, how the house felt empty after she was gone. I remember stopping mid-motion, knife in hand, because I knew that emptiness too well. So I listened. Really listened. Because no one had listened to me in years. Sometimes, he'd ask about my life, about what I used to dream of before marriage, before motherhood. No one had asked me that in a long time either. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself answering honestly. I used to want to teach literature, I told him once. But life got busy, and dreams shifted. He smiled softly and said, "You'd be good at it. You speak like someone who still believes in beautiful things." That sentence stayed with me. It shouldn't have, but it did. Soon, I caught myself doing things I hadn't done in years. Brushing my hair differently. Putting on a touch of lipstick before the boys came home, or before he did. I'd tell myself it was silly, that I just wanted to look presentable. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. There was one afternoon I'll never forget. Ethan was stuck in traffic, and Liam arrived first, again. It was raining outside, the same way it had that first day. He offered to help me carry groceries from the car. I said yes. We were halfway up the driveway when one of the bags slipped from my hand. Liam reached down at the same time I did. Our fingers brushed. It was just a touch, skin against skin, quick and innocent. But it felt like time froze. My breath caught. The sound of the rain faded. And for a second, it felt like there was nothing else in the world, just that fleeting, dangerous spark. When our eyes met, something in his expression made my chest tighten. He wasn't just looking at me, he was seeing me. And I hated how good that felt. I pulled my hand back quickly, forcing a laugh, pretending nothing happened. But my heart was racing. I said something, I don't even remember what. Probably some clumsy excuse about how cold it was. He smiled, gentle and unassuming. But I could see it in his eyes, he felt it too. Inside, the air felt thicker than usual. He followed me into the kitchen, his shirt damp from the rain. I told him to take off his jacket so I could put it by the heater. He hesitated, then slipped it off slowly. As he handed it to me, I noticed a faint drop of rain rolling down his temple. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed it away with my fingers. It was such a small gesture, one any caring adult might make. But when my skin touched his, he froze. And so did I. The moment hung there, silent, electric. Then I quickly withdrew my hand, pretending to adjust the collar of his shirt to cover the awkwardness. My fingers trembled. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I couldn't. That evening, I tried to distract myself, cooked dinner, cleaned up, forced smiles through Ethan's stories. But every time I caught myself zoning out, it was his face I saw. That smile. Those eyes. The way he said thank you like it meant something more. I hated myself for it. I told myself, "You're being ridiculous. He's just a boy. This isn't real." But then another voice whispered back, "Then why does your heart skip every time he looks at you?" I started noticing things I hadn't before. How he'd linger near the kitchen door before leaving. How his voice softened when he said goodbye. How he seemed to find excuses to help me, carrying boxes, fixing the loose light bulb Daniel had ignored for months. Each moment was small, harmless on its own. But together, they started to build something dangerous, a quiet rhythm between us that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. I began anticipating his presence. The way the house felt warmer when he was in it. The way laughter sounded lighter around him. I told myself it was all innocent. But deep down, I knew I was crossing invisible lines, one glance, one touch at a time. That night, as I lay in bed, the rain still falling softly outside, I found myself replaying every second. The brush of our hands. The sound of his voice. The way he looked at me like I mattered. I buried my face in my pillow, whispering to myself, I hated myself for feeling this way. But I also hated how alive it made me feel. And for the first time, I wondered, was I the only one feeling it? That night, the storm came earlier than the forecast predicted. The sky turned dark before dinner, clouds heavy and impatient. Ethan had left earlier that morning for a 3-day school trip, his first time away without us. The house felt too quiet, almost hollow. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a cup of tea, when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. When I opened it, there he was, Liam. His hair was damp from the rain, his jacket clinging to his shoulders. He smiled faintly, holding out a book. "I just came to return this," he said, almost apologetically. It was one of Ethan's novels. I should have told him to leave. To come back when Ethan was home. But instead, I said, "You're drenched. Come inside before you catch a cold." He hesitated for a moment before stepping in. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The kind of night where even silence feels alive. We sat across from each other in the living room, him on the couch, me on the armchair, the soft hum of the storm between us. We talked about ordinary things at first. His classes. The project. The rain. But as thunder rolled outside and the lights flickered, something shifted. The conversation grew quieter, more honest. He spoke about his mother again. How nights like this reminded him of sitting beside her, watching the lightning through the window. He said he missed her laugh. Her warmth. Her way of making everything feel okay. I listened, my chest tightening. "I'm sorry," I said softly. She sounded like someone who loved deeply. He nodded, his eyes glistening. "She did. And since she passed, I've just felt lost. Like I'm walking through rooms where no one sees me anymore." Something inside me broke a little at those words. Because that was exactly how I'd been feeling. Before I could stop myself, I whispered, "I know what that feels like." He looked up, his gaze meeting mine, steady, searching. "What do you mean?" I smiled faintly, but my voice cracked. "I live in a house full of people, yet most days, I feel invisible. Like I'm here, but not really seen." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Only the sound of the rain filled the space between us. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The storm had cut the power. Everything went black. When I finally went to bed, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself, maybe this is what punishment feels like. Not loud. Not cruel. Just quiet. Lingering. Constant. And as sleep slowly pulled me under, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence between Liam and me was louder than any confession could ever be. Days turned into weeks. And with every sunrise, I found myself waking to the same ache in my chest, a quiet reminder that peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from learning to live with what can't be undone. I kept asking myself the same question, what was it, really? Was it love? Was it grief? Or just loneliness wearing a disguise so convincing I believed it was something deeper? Because when I replayed that night in my mind, it wasn't passion I saw. It was need, raw, aching need. The kind that creeps into your soul when you've been starved of warmth for too long. Liam wasn't the mistake. He was the symptom. Of everything I'd buried beneath years of pretending. Of every silent dinner. Every unanswered look. Every night Daniel turned away in his sleep. I used to think loneliness meant being alone. But I learned it's possible to feel completely invisible, even when someone sleeps inches from you. That's what drew me in, not the thrill, not the temptation, but the relief of finally being seen. When Liam looked at me, it wasn't with desire at first. It was with understanding. The kind you only find in someone else who's quietly breaking. And maybe that's what scared me most, that it didn't feel wrong until it was too late. One evening, I sat by the window again, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Daniel was home, sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. The same routine. The same silence. Only now, I felt like a stranger in my own home. He asked about dinner, I said something short, distracted. He didn't notice. He never did. Everything between us looked the same. But nothing was the same. Because now, even in his distance, I could no longer claim innocence. I'd crossed a line that couldn't be unseen. A line that lived quietly between every word we spoke and every silence we shared. At night, I'd lie there, staring into the dark, thinking about how a simple act of kindness, a shared smile, a comforting word, can so easily turn into a dangerous escape. I thought about how fragile the human heart is, how easily it confuses care for connection, and attention for affection. I thought about Liam, his nervous laughter, his eyes when he said goodbye. How quickly something pure became tainted by need. And then I thought about myself. About the woman I used to be before all this. Before I learned that guilt doesn't need witnesses to thrive. I realized you can betray someone without ever being caught, I whispered to myself one night, my voice barely audible even to me. Because guilt is its own prison. And I was already serving my sentence. Every glance Daniel gave me felt like a test I couldn't pass. Every innocent word from Ethan reminded me of the person I failed to be. And every time I smiled in public, I wondered if people could see it, the weight behind my eyes, the quiet fracture running through my chest. I started avoiding the mirror. Not because I hated what I saw, but because I didn't recognize her anymore. There was a sadness there, subtle, but constant. Like a shadow that refused to leave. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in passing, and for a fleeting second, I'd see her, the woman I once was. The wife who still believed in second chances. The mother who felt safe in her own home. The woman who thought she'd never be the kind who crosses lines. But then the moment would pass. And I'd be her again, the one who did. The irony was cruel. For the first time in years, I understood my husband's silence. Because now, I had my own. And it was deafening. He didn't have to know. He didn't have to ask. The distance between us was enough to tell the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud. We were both lonely, just in different ways. Maybe that's what marriage becomes sometimes, two people quietly drifting, pretending not to notice how far they've gone. And yet, in all the guilt and regret, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if, in that fleeting moment of connection, I'd finally touched something real. Something that reminded me I was still human, still capable of feeling, even if it came at the wrong time, in the wrong way, with the wrong person. But feelings, I've learned, don't care about timing. They just arrive, and leave you to clean up the wreckage. So tell me. What do you think it was? Was it loneliness? The kind that slowly eats away at your sanity until you'll take warmth from anywhere it's offered? Was it weakness? A fleeting moment where desire overpowered reason? Or was it something deeper, something that can't be defined, only felt by those who've ever longed for more than what life gave them? Because sometimes, what looks like betrayal, is really just the desperate act of someone who forgot what it felt like to be alive. And yet, that doesn't make it right. It just makes it human. So I'll ask you, if you were in her place, would you confess? Would you look into your husband's eyes and shatter the fragile peace that still exists between you? Or would you carry that secret alone, pretending everything is fine, while the guilt quietly eats away at you from the inside? There's no easy answer. There never is when hearts are involved. Speech balloon, tell me in the comments, what do you think she should do? Should she tell the truth, or live with the silence she created? And if this story touched something deep inside you, if it made you think about how fragile love, trust, and loneliness can be, then hit that like button. Subscribe to Stories by TE, because every week, we uncover